Hello, I'm Carrie Brown. I'm the director of the social journalism program at the Newmark J School at CUNY. And today I'm going to try to offer you some ideas about how engaged journalism can help you serve communities in more effective and creative ways during this time of crisis, and also when, of course, most of us are working remotely. I'm going to share some of the things that we've learned from 5 years of developing curriculum for our master's degree in social journalism, and also from my students and my alumni's great work, both during this time of crisis and beforehand. So to get us started, it's always helpful to begin with a little bit of a definition of what is engaged journalism, or social journalism as we call it at the Newmark School. It's essentially the same thing. Engaged journalism is really animated by the belief that as journalism is traditionally practiced, it could do much better at listening to communities and understanding their information needs and how to make important information more relevant to them. And we have a variety of techniques and strategies that help us to do that. Also, engaged journalism tries to do better at finding creative ways to deliver information to people in ways that are most useful or practical for them. And yes, of course, sometimes that means stories as we traditionally think of them in journalism, whether that's text or video or photo, but it also can sometimes mean other things like text messages or social media or postcards, or something like theater or comedy if you really want to go a little more outside of the box. Engaged journalism tries to also be very thoughtful and better about involving communities that have historically been left out of mainstream media news coverage, and also helping people to participate more actively in the news process, to work with them rather than for them. So you can kind of see in this slide here, Terry Paris Jr., who's one of our faculty members. He's also the engagement director at the city, a relatively new local news nonprofit here in New York City. He is running an open newsroom in Brooklyn during better days in which we could, of course, actually do that face-to-face. What Terry and some of my students as well that work with him do is bring residents together to really talk about what they perceived as the biggest concerns and issues in their community. And then they use that information to really inform the city's coverage and the types of stories that they do. So here's also another quick definition of engaged journalism from Lindsay Green Barber. She is the founder and CEO of Impact Architects. She works with a lot of different news organizations across the country on how they can best produce and also measure and track their impact. And I think having this as a definition is useful. Engaged journalism is an inclusive practice that prioritizes the information needs and wants of community members it serves, creates collaborative space for the audience in all aspects of the journalism process, and is dedicated to building and preserving trusting relationships between journalists and the public. So thanks to Lindsay for coming up with that one. So why are engaged journalism techniques particularly useful in serving communities right now? People desperately need very specific local information about just very survival oriented needs, you know, access to healthcare and testing, where they can get food, how they can access various economic benefits as those become available. People are also being bombarded by misinformation that social journalists can help correct. I was just reading yesterday an article about how Snopes is having trouble even keeping up with all the fact checking that is required during the pandemic as people share misinformation around, you know, cures, the origins of the virus, things like that. So of course we do need a more traditional, you know, journalistic approach to holding public officials accountable for their response to the pandemic, but we also need to really be sure that we're answering people's specific local questions, really helping them get the information that they need to navigate the crisis. And I think this will be relevant even after kind of the more immediate issues are gone, you know, even as we start going back to work and school, the fallout from this, economically speaking, is going to be long term. So people are going to have these kinds of questions for a long time. And a real kind of, I guess you could say, a bonus of this, aside from it just being the right thing for us to do and a good way for us to use our skills, is that this is really a way to build trust. And amid the current devastation in advertising, which of course was already on the declining before this, trust is something we really need to think about more as we rely on things like subscriptions and memberships to stay afloat financially as news organizations. If we are providing very material value in people's lives, they are much more likely to be willing to support us in a more direct kind of way. So I think this is valuable from that perspective as well. So now I'll get into just a few different specific ideas and tools that are also geared to the fact that you are probably self-isolating and therefore not doing the normal kinds of face-to-face reporting that you might otherwise do. First of all, finding out where people in your community are communicating now. Let me just note that when I say community, I mean that, of course, that could be a neighborhood or a geographical community, but it also could be the ways people organize themselves around an issue, or if they are affected by something in a particular way. So you can kind of define that in the way that makes the most sense for your organization. Even communities that have primarily interacted face-to-face in the past are now, of course, as we all are, gathering online as much as possible. So what are they using? And it's going to be different for each community. Is it a Facebook group? Is it WhatsApp, Twitter, Nextdoor, Reddit, something else? I pulled this example just because I happen to live in Jersey City. This is Reddit. This is kind of a more fun thread where people are just sharing favorite parts of their homes, but there's also other types of information sharing that are going on there as well. An important part of interacting with your community online is to observe how people are communicating a little bit before jumping in, so you can figure out ways that as a journalist you can participate without violating group norms. So you really want to kind of brainstorm a little bit, test your approach to digital communities, especially if you haven't already developed a strong relationship with them, because this is one thing my students have found, is just that having a journalist suddenly barge into, like, say, a Facebook group may be more surprising or off-putting than it is reassuring to a lot of people. And that doesn't mean that you don't have skills to offer or that they may not ultimately welcome you, but you really need to be kind of thoughtful in that initial approach if you want people to trust you. The second thing is that this crisis, of course, is going to have disproportionate impact, as we know, unfortunately, based on some of the data that you can see there. People that have experienced poverty or discrimination in myriad forms are particularly at risk for both the virus and, of course, the economic fallout. Clearly, that also affects journalism in other ways, in that not everyone is going to have broadband access, or they may have other technological limitations that affect how they're able to receive your journalism. So there's no one-size-fits-all recipe to something like this, but we really need to think about how can we be creative as possible in reaching communities. And text messaging or WhatsApp may be particularly essential, because even folks that may not have broadband access often are able to use those tools to communicate with their friends and family, and also with journalists. This is an example from Outlier Media in Detroit. They have long used text messaging as a key part of their strategy. They typically covered housing issues in Detroit, but you can see here that they've really pivoted to covering COVID-19 related issues. They are able to communicate very specific types of information to people via text. So Ground Source is also a tool that is available for you to consider using as another way of kind of managing text messaging, you know, having that information flow into a spreadsheet on the back end where it's easy for you to access. These might be the kinds of things that you need to think about during a crisis like this to be sure you're reaching everyone in your community. Secondly, in engaged reporting, we really recommend always looking for partners or collaborators. You know, who is already connected with or trusted by your community? Who could you help in some way? This is always a great idea, but even more so now. You know, are there nonprofit organizations that are already distributing information to people during this crisis, or other news organizations that work in a different medium than you do, for example, or universities? You know, many classes are looking for projects, many internships have been canceled, students are available to come in and help. Work with communities. What kinds of things can you leverage to really increase the impact of your efforts? Andrea Hart from City Bureau in Chicago, very innovative newsroom that really focuses on relationships with the community, points out that we really need to follow the lead of people that have been doing grassroots work. We all want to do something, but following those folks that have already developed trust really is the best way to kind of help everyday people and to insert ourselves as journalists in a more effective way. So that's an important thing to think about. Another one is doing an information needs assessment in your community related specifically to COVID-19. We're very fortunate that the Listening Post Collective on their website has just an absolutely rich amount of tools and a playbook and questions that you can sort of repurpose or tweak for this situation and for your community specifically, to just really understand exactly what the needs are. I would also try to make sure here that you're not, again, duplicating the efforts of other organizations when you do this. And also being mindful that, you know, there may still be some non-COVID related information needs that are still important. You know, some of them may be less relevant right now, but others of them may still be a major concern to your community. So that's something to kind of think about. Another thing to think about doing is developing a spreadsheet of some of the key sources of COVID-19 information in your community that you can check in with on a very systematic basis, whether that's daily or weekly or whatever it might be. You know, either by going to a specific place online or communicating with someone directly via phone or text. And this isn't necessarily completely revolutionary. I mean, beat reporters have always done this with their trusted sources, but I think you can kind of expand the way that you're thinking about it in the crisis context, and also focusing as locally as possible or as narrowly as possible, because, you know, for example, this is my ward council person in Jersey City, James Solomon. He's a good source of information, very active on Twitter and Facebook. And while every news organization, you know, is talking to Governor Cuomo of New York, or, you know, some of the other sources that are very common or typical, you can really add targeted value by going to some of the other sources that have important information to share, but may get typically less attention. So I would really think about government or nonprofit websites, or, you know, Twitter accounts that are useful and really regularly updated, and then, you know, come up with a very systematic way of checking in with these sources so that you can then answer questions and really inform your reporting around these things that are going on in communities. Next, you know, social journalists, we love to bring people together to have conversations around their perspectives and what matters to them in the news. And of course, that's more challenging now with the coronavirus, but, you know, can you still bring people together digitally using Zoom or Google Hangouts or similar to commiserate or brainstorm solutions to specific problems or other purposes, even if it's just, you know, to have a conversation with someone when people are feeling a little bit lonely or depressed. And, you know, it's certainly important to be mindful that not everybody has the bandwidth or even the interest to participate in online gatherings, but in some communities, being a convener could still have tremendous value. There's an example down here of Free Press. Early on, they held community meetings via Zoom to talk about how people were responding to these times of uncertainty. So it's still a tool that you can potentially use, and there's a lot of resources out there on how to run an effective online community meeting that you can take advantage of. Another strategy is to collect questions and of course report on the answers to them. Harkin is an organization that has some software as well as consulting and other information that is all built around collecting questions from communities, even in better times. KBPC in California has really done an outstanding job of answering and collecting questions around the pandemic, as well as previously they did a lot of work around elections and the census as well. You know, because new questions are constantly going to keep coming up as this goes on. And this is a really excellent way to serve your communities. One thing that my students have found in doing this work is that, you know, if you want people to submit questions for you, you really have to design a good prompt. And sometimes that takes a little bit of testing and experimentation to see what works. But one of the most powerful things about this is that as you're going out and reporting the answers to these questions, you know, you can go to a council member or a mayor or any other public official and, you know, say your constituents have the following questions for you. And that's such a simple thing in a lot of ways, but it can be a powerful way to involve the public more directly in your reporting. You of course have to be very creative and proactive about collecting questions from people that maybe are traditionally underserved by media or government. It's also another area where partnering with another organization could make a lot of sense to kind of pump up your efforts in doing something like this. These are just a few quick examples that I will run through of some other organizations that are doing interesting things that you might want to look at or that have resources that are available to you. This is Simon Galperin. He's one of my alumni and the director of the Community Information Cooperatives. He's doing some really interesting work in Bloomfield, New Jersey, in terms of collecting information needs and answering questions that people have on the Bloomfield Information Project website that you can see over here. So it's just an example of some of the things I was just talking about in action. The city, which I mentioned previously, they've done a number of FAQs answering questions around, you know, how to navigate unemployment benefits and the long hold times and convoluted bureaucracy that a lot of people have had to face as a result of that. You can see on the right side that they have a call out that they've done newsroom-wide Reddit Ask Me Anythings, in which, you know, they've really invited the public to talk to all of their reporters and editors about anything that they were interested in or didn't understand about, you know, New York City's response to the crisis. So they've done a number of very creative things. First Draft is just a wonderful resource. First Draft helps journalists combat misinformation and disinformation. They do that around elections often, but of course now they've pivoted to really focusing on the coronavirus. Their website is outstanding, and it has guided trainings that will help you with things like social search and verification, and also give you advice on how you can debunk rumors without inadvertently amplifying misinformation. You can see in the bottom right, my students were lucky enough to have a training from them. This is another incredible service that we can perform from communities and kind of stop the spread of misinformation, particularly on social media, which I think we all know is often an issue during a crisis. Solutions journalism, I have an alum, Alan Arthur, that works there. His picture is up here. I mean, of course, journalists are reporting a lot on the problems and issues associated with an epidemic, but there are also communities that are coming up with solutions. You know, San Francisco shut down relatively early and has had fewer deaths as a result. What are other public policies that have been particularly effective in combating the pandemic. You know, journalists need to be reporting on these things as well. Solutions journalism has tons of tools for how to do this. They have a story tracker so that you can potentially see an example that you could replicate, you know, in your state or your city. It's just a really useful resource for thinking this through. So this is just an example of how, you know, one reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer got creative in how they reach people during this. So a lot of this is, again, trying new things and really trying to connect with people and better understanding what is most important to them and what they need the most during a crisis like this. So, you know, the public really does need us now, I think, more than ever, even as journalism itself as a business is struggling. This is, of course, we're seeing almost record numbers of people coming to us for more information. But I think it's also important in closing here to just remember that you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before helping others. You know, being sure that as journalists, we're also taking care of ourselves, and, you know, don't try all of these strategies all at once, because that can be pretty overwhelming. But choose one or two that maybe really seem interesting to you or fit well with the communities that you serve, and just start experimenting. And I think this can be a very meaningful and hopeful way to do journalism during such a difficult time. So thanks, everyone.